There's a moment I've kept turning over in my mind for years now, a single line buried in a Ming dynasty court document, a line that shouldn't exist if everything we were taught about pre-colonial Southeast Asia were true. Welcome to Echoes of Ancients. If you've been searching for the parts of Philippine history that didn't make it into your textbooks, subscribe now. This is exactly where those stories live. Well, the line described a textile, not Chinese silk. Well, not silk from the looms of Suzhou or Hangzhou. Silk from an archipelago to the south, described in the document as cloth that moved like water and held color the way lacquer holds light. The court official who wrote those words wasn't being poetic. He was explaining to his superiors why the emperor had accepted it as a tribute gift of equal standing. Not lesser, equal. That detail vanishes almost immediately from the surviving record. And the question worth living with isn't why it was destroyed. The question is how it existed at all. Let's start with what most people assume about ancient Filipino textile culture. The assumption runs deep, even among Filipinos themselves. Pre-colonial Philippines, in the popular imagination, was a collection of scattered barangays, capable certainly, but not sophisticated enough to produce luxury goods that could move empires. This is the argument on one side of the ledger, and it's not entirely without logic. On the other hand, the archipelago was fragmented. It had no unified bureaucracy to organize production at scale. No single court was large enough to command the kind of labor that Chinese imperial workshops deployed. These are real constraints. Anyone who dismisses them entirely is romanticizing rather than thinking. But here's what that argument gets wrong. It assumes sophistication requires centralization. It assumes that only empires produce things worth keeping. Archaeological digs at sites in Cebu, in Mindanao, in the Cagayan Valley have turned up spindle whorls dating back over 1,000 years. Not imported spindle whorls. Locally made, locally used. The fiber cultures of the pre-colonial Philippines were producing thread from abaca, from pineapple leaf, from silk-producing insects native to the islands, long before anyone in Beijing thought to write them down. Abaca fiber, when processed by hands that had worked it for generations, produces something that defies casual description. It catches light differently than cotton. It drapes with a weight that silk itself struggles to match. Early Chinese traders didn't call it inferior. They called it strange. Strangeness in the vocabulary of Chinese merchant culture was often a precursor to desire. Now here is the side of the argument that should make us uncomfortable. You know, ancient Filipino weavers were extraordinary. That part holds. But were they producing silk specifically? Actual silk from silkworm cultivation? Or were we dealing with something that Chinese observers simply called silk because they lacked a better word? This is an honest problem. Chinese trade documents used the character for silk loosely. Certain fine plant fiber textiles from Southeast Asia were recorded under the same classification as sericulture silk simply because they had a similar sheen. So when we read those court records and find references to Filipino textile tributes being received with unusual ceremony, we have to ask, was the Chinese court bowing to actual silk or to something so strange and beautiful it broke their categories? The answer genuinely might be both. And that ambiguity is not a defeat for Philippine history. It's the most interesting part. Because what the weaving traditions of Mindanao's indigenous communities, the Maranao and Taboli and Bagobo, were doing was not replicating sericulture. They were running a parallel experiment, an independent discovery of what thread can become when you push it far enough. The abaca-based cloth they produced, what we now call piña in one tradition, and what the Maranao called landap in another, required a level of technical refinement that no casual society produces. These were specialized crafts protected within specific lineages. the knowledge passed from mother to daughter across generations under protocols as strict as any guild system in medieval Europe. Strict, slow, deliberate, and somehow producing cloth that made Chinese officials reach for their finest descriptive language. Here's where randomness enters the story. And randomness is the part no one wants to credit, because randomness is uncomfortable. We prefer narratives where brilliance is deliberate. Around the late 14th and early 15th centuries, the Sulu Sultanate was beginning to formalize its trade networks with the southern Chinese ports. These weren't diplomatic missions engineered by some long-range strategic mind. They were merchants following profit, following weather, following rumors about which ports were taxing cargo lightly that season. The early Sulu traders who brought Filipino textiles into sustained contact with Chinese markets didn't do it on behalf of a vision. They did it because the wind was favorable and the boat was available. Chance. The Sulu traders had no master plan. And yet, because the trade routes aligned, because a particular season's weather pushed certain vessels toward Fujian rather than the Champa coast, a Sulu trader carrying textiles found himself in a market where Chinese merchants were actively hungry for novelty. The Yongle Emperor's court was in a phase of aggressive curiosity about the outside world. Zheng He's voyages were reshaping what Beijing understood to be the extent of the known world. Into that specific moment of maximum Chinese curiosity arrived, by absolute accident, a bolt of cloth that no one in the Forbidden City had seen before. The official who received it didn't know what to do with it. He recorded it. He sent it upward. And somewhere in that chain, it reached someone with enough authority to place it alongside gifts from kingdoms the Chinese considered peers. That moment, that single bureaucratic decision made by a mid-level official who was probably just trying not to lose his position, became the foundation of a trade relationship that would funnel significant wealth into the Sulu archipelago for decades. No one planned it. The official didn't know he was making history. The Sulu merchant didn't know he was starting a dynasty's worth of commerce. The weaver who made the cloth was almost certainly dead before anyone recorded her work's reception in Beijing. This is how things actually happen, not in boardrooms, not in throne rooms, in accidents. But the Ming court documents, the destruction, this deserves its own careful look, because this is where the story gets ethically complicated, not conspiratorial, but genuinely complicated. The Yongle Emperor died. His successors were more conservative, less interested in foreign curiosity. The Confucian bureaucratic faction that had always been suspicious of maritime trade began, slowly and then rapidly, reasserting control over what the court officially acknowledged about the outside world. The records of anomalous tributary gifts, gifts that didn't fit the established hierarchy of civilizations, became administratively inconvenient. Not a secret cabal, not a targeted erasure of Filipino achievement, just bureaucrats tidying up a classification system that had become messy. The same force that has destroyed more history than any fire or flood. Institutional indifference. Precisely indifference. Records that didn't fit the approved story of how the world was organized got reclassified, shelved, or simply not recopied when the originals degraded. This is the mundane catastrophe of historical knowledge. It doesn't require villains. It requires only people doing their jobs and defining their jobs narrowly. What survived did so in fragments, in the records of Sulu trade missions preserved partially in later Philippine oral traditions, in passing references inside Chinese local gazetteers from Fujian, documents too provincial to be caught up in the capital's cleanup, in the textile traditions themselves, still alive, still being practiced, still producing cloth of a quality that researchers from outside the Philippines arrive to study and leave visibly humbled. The cloth survived because it was never just a trade good. It was knowledge, and knowledge encoded in the hands of weavers is harder to destroy than knowledge encoded in paper. Now for the part that matters beyond the medieval record. Stand back far enough from any of this, and you see a pattern that runs through every culture that was colonized, then taught to see its own past through the colonizer's lens. The lesson absorbed, quietly over generations, is that sophistication came from elsewhere. That beauty required external validation, that if something wasn't written down by the empire, it didn't quite count. Incidentally, the Ming court's partial recognition of Filipino textile art was an accident, a lucky convergence of timing, weather, curiosity, and one merchant's pragmatic route choice. But that accident tells us something the systematic historical record refused to say, that the archipelago was not a passive recipient of civilization. It was generating things that moved the world's most powerful court to unusual behavior. And the destruction of those records, that bureaucratic tidying, couldn't quite destroy the evidence. Because the evidence was never only in the documents, it was in the hands. It was in the looms. It was in the fiber memory of communities that kept weaving through colonialism, through suppression, through the long decades when being proudly pre-colonial was almost a form of resistance. A Taboli weaver in South Cotabato today, working a backstrap loom, is not recreating something lost. She is continuing something unbroken. The chain from her to that nameless weaver whose cloth confused a Ming dynasty official is long and tangled and full of near extinctions. But it didn't break. Sometimes what history erases, the hands remember. By the way, and sometimes the most powerful argument for a civilization's greatness isn't a throne room or a recorded military victory. Sometimes it's a bolt of cloth so precise, so strange, so achingly beautiful, that a foreign emperor didn't quite know what to do except acknowledge it. Chaos made that moment. An accident preserved it. And a tradition kept it alive when every system designed to document it had failed. That should tell us something about where the real keepers of history live. Not always in archives, not always in official memory. Sometimes in the quiet work of hands that never stopped.